The town of Pine Hollow had long been forgotten by maps and bypassed by time. Tucked between misty ridges and crumbling oak groves, it was a place where people lived quietly, and most days passed without much fuss. On the edge of this forgotten town stood a crooked little house with peeling white paint, wind chimes that never stopped singing, and a porch that creaked with every breath of the wind. It was on that porch that Arthur Quinn sat every morning, a knitted blanket over his knees, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands, and his eyes scanning the tree line as though waiting for something or someone who never came. He was 80, with hands as gnarled as the woods he loved, and a heart still tender from losing his wife, Edna, 5 winters ago. Next door, in a similar weathered house, lived Mildred Millie Clark. At 76, she wore her grief differently. Her garden was always blooming, her scarves always bright, but her house echoed too loudly with silence. Her only child had moved to Chicago, and her husband's flannel coats still hung untouched in the closet. The two of them spoke in glances more than words. Millie would bring over pie when Arthur's firewood stack looked low. Arthur would fix her screen door without asking. They were not friends, not quite, but they were something else, survivors of time's long march. Then, one gray morning in early October, the silence broke. A strange sound echoed through the fog, like a whimper, soft and raw. Arthur straightened in his chair. Millie paused mid-step on her morning walk. The sound came again, closer now, more desperate. Arthur stood, grabbed his old walking stick, and stepped off the porch. Neither of them knew then, but that sound would change everything. The cry led Arthur to the edge of the woods behind his home, where the grass grew wild and the brambles caught at his boots. He paused for a moment, letting the wind settle. There it was again, a sharp, broken sound. Not human. Not a dog. Something else. Something small. He stepped carefully into the underbrush, the cold mist curling around his legs. Millie, who had been watching from the end of the gravel path, called out gently, "Arthur, don't go too far. Could be a fox or a coyote." Arthur didn't answer. His breath was shallow, heart pounding with something he couldn't name. A stirring. A hunch. A memory, maybe. Then he saw it. Nestled in a hollow between 2 fallen logs, trembling and soaked with dew, was a bear cub. Tiny. No more than a few months old. Its fur was matted with burrs, one paw wrapped awkwardly under its body, and its eyes, those wide, wet eyes, looked up at Arthur without fear, only exhaustion. Arthur knelt slowly. His knees cracked, but he barely noticed. "Well, now," he whispered. "Where's your mama, little one?" The cub made a soft grunting sound, tried to shift, and whimpered again. That was when Arthur saw the blood, dried and dark, staining the small creature's flank. His gut clenched. A wound. Not fresh, but not healing either. Millie appeared beside him, panting from the walk. When her eyes landed on the cub, she froze. "Dear God," she breathed. Is it alone?" Arthur nodded. "Hurt, too. Looks like it's been limping for days." Millie stepped closer and knelt beside him, her floral scarf brushing against the leaves. She had always had a gentleness about her, a way animals trusted. Slowly, she reached out a hand. The bear sniffed it, then leaned, as if it knew it had nothing left to lose. "What do we do?" she asked. Arthur stared at the cub for a long time, then at the silent forest behind them. "We take it in," he said. Millie's eyes widened. "Arthur Quinn, we're not young, and that's a wild animal." "I know," he replied, lifting the cub into his arms with a care that startled even himself. But I don't think it has anyone else. Milly didn't argue. She just held open the gate as Arthur walked back toward his house, cradling a bear cub that had no business surviving, and no reason to trust, but somehow, against all odds, had found the two loneliest hearts in town. They laid the cub on a blanket in the guest room, though calling it that was generous. It had once been Arthur's study, then a storage room, and finally a half-forgotten space where Milly folded laundry and kept old books she couldn't part with. But that night, it became a den. The cub didn't fight them. It didn't have the strength. It simply curled into the fleece blanket Milly had warmed by the fire, its breath raspy and shallow. Arthur pulled up a stool and sat beside it, his eyes never leaving the rise and fall of its small body. Milly, pacing, asked the question they'd both been circling. "What if it dies, Arthur?" He didn't look up. "Then at least it won't die cold and alone." They named him Finn. It came naturally, without discussion. Milly had said, "He looks like a Finn," and Arthur had nodded like he'd known all along. Finn's wound was worse than they'd thought, likely a puncture, maybe from a trap or a sharp rock. They couldn't know for sure. There were no wildlife vets in Stillbrook, and even if there had been, who would treat a bear cub brought in by a retired mailman and a widowed piano teacher? So they did what they could. They cleaned the wound with warm water and iodine, bandaged it as best they knew how. Milly brewed bone broth and fed it to Finn from an eyedropper at first, then a baby bottle she found buried in an old box marked, "Emily, 1982. They barely slept those first few nights, trading shifts like new parents. When Finn whimpered in pain, Arthur sang softly, old Irish folk songs his mother used to hum when storms rattled the roof. It was the strangest kind of healing, slow, uncertain, but undeniable. A week later, Finn stood on all fours, wobbly but upright, and licked peanut butter off Arthur's fingers like it was his birthright. Milly watched from the doorway, her heart aching with something she hadn't felt in years. "He trusts you," she said. Arthur looked up, surprised by the crack in her voice. "He trusts us." She smiled. "God help him." That night, they moved Finn's bedding closer to the living room, near the fireplace. He waddled a few feet behind them, dragging a sock he'd claimed as his new favorite thing. When he flopped down with a grunt and rested his head on Arthur's boot, Milly saw something shift in her husband's eyes, a softness, like the thaw after a long winter. Stillbrook was a quiet town. People noticed things. So when Walter Jenkins from the hardware store asked why Arthur had been buying canned salmon in bulk, Arthur just smiled and said, "House guest." It wasn't a lie. It was the beginning of something neither of them could have planned for. A story no one would believe. A chapter in two lives that, until now, had felt mostly written. But with a bear cub sleeping beside their fireplace and a kind of warmth they thought they'd buried with the years, something was beginning again. The snow began to melt in patches, revealing the stubborn earth beneath. Icicles dripped from porch eaves like ticking clocks, and the old creek at the edge of town began to gurgle again, its voice returning after a long silence. With spring nudging at the corners of winter, Stillbrook came alive, and so did the whispers. It started with the mailman. Milly opened the door one morning to find young Travis Hines, barely 20 and fresh-faced, staring past her shoulder with his mouth slightly open. "What's that in there?" he asked, squinting. "That," Milly said calmly, blocking his view with her body, "is none of your business." Travis blinked. "I think it's a bear." Milly took the letters from his frozen hand and shut the door gently. Behind her, Finn was standing on his hind legs, smudging the front window with his nose as he watched a bird fluttering in the branches outside. He sneezed and tumbled backward, startling himself. Arthur, lounging in his worn recliner with a crossword puzzle, chuckled. "You think that'll stay quiet for long?" Millie sighed. "It never does." By the weekend, Stillbrook was buzzing. They didn't tell the full story, not yet. But it didn't take long for word to spread that the Mayfields had taken in something unusual. Walter Jenkins stopped by with extra wood, though he lingered more than he needed to. Susan from the diner brought over a pie and asked if they'd had any visitors. And Pastor Dale, a gentleman with too many dogs and not enough parishioners, offered to bless whatever's in the house, if they thought it might help. Arthur just smiled and said, "We're managing fine, Pastor." They weren't hiding Finn out of shame. It wasn't even fear. It was something quieter, more sacred. They were protecting a secret that had grown into a bond. He wasn't just a bear cub anymore. He was part of the home, part of their healing, part of their story. But as Finn grew, so did the reality they had to face. By March's end, he was twice the size he'd been when they found him, stronger and more curious. He'd chewed through 2 couch legs, climbed the pantry shelves, and discovered how to open the refrigerator, resulting in a messy affair involving 6 boiled eggs and a block of cheese. "He can't stay in the house forever," Millie said one night, her voice heavy with reluctance. Arthur nodded slowly, his hand resting on Finn's thick back as the cub dozed at his feet. "I know." That was the night they made a plan. They would build something, not a cage, not a pen, but a space. A haven. A place outside where Finn could grow wild and safe, not just alive, but free. Arthur found old blueprints in the shed. Millie called the county to ask about permits without giving too many details. They didn't have much money, but Stillbrook had always been a town where hands helped hands, and fences were more symbolic than practical. And as they began measuring and hammering, sawing and digging, something remarkable happened. The town didn't turn them in. It showed up. First it was Travis Hines with spare lumber. Then Susan's brother brought a generator. Then Pastor Dale arrived with a coil of fencing and a prayer in his pocket. No one asked too many questions. And when they saw Finn, shy at first, hiding behind Arthur's legs but eventually curious enough to approach, no one screamed. Instead, they whispered things like, "Would you look at that?" and "He trusts them," and "He doesn't seem dangerous." It wasn't just about a bear cub anymore. It was about 2 people who had lost something unnamed and had found a reason to wake up again. It was about a town that had forgotten how to believe in second chances, remembering. And it was about Finn, a creature once broken, now bold, padding softly into a world that had decided to make room for him. Spring unfurled its green fingers across Stillbrook, touching everything with new life. The once barren trees outside the Mayfields' home wore fresh buds, and the air smelled like damp soil and distant blossoms. Each morning, birds chattered on the eaves, and each evening, frogs sang from the thawed creek. Finn had taken to sitting on the porch just after breakfast, his chin resting on the railing like a sleepy dog, watching the world go by. Children walking home from school began stopping at the end of the Mayfields' driveway, whispering and pointing. "He's real," they'd say. "He waves," said another. Finn didn't wave, of course. But he did sit still and blink with the calm solemnity of a creature that understood he was being watched and judged, and somehow, he didn't mind. The enclosure wasn't done, not yet. But every day brought a new step forward. Arthur worked slowly but steadily, his movements careful but practiced. His hands, once thick with muscle from lifting mailbags and hauling boxes, had thinned with age, but they still knew how to build. He carved posts from timber donated by neighbors and lined the fence with mesh, strong enough to keep Finn safe, soft enough not to feel like prison. Millie painted signs in her neat cursive, "Sanctuary in Progress." She planted marigolds near the fence and lavender near the gate. "He'll like the smell," she said. "And so will the bees." Stillbrook's support surprised them. They'd expected resistance, lectures about danger or legality. But instead, they were met with quiet acceptance and something more. People brought food, books, even donations. The local high school art teacher offered to paint a mural on the side of the barn, a forest scene, with a little bear and two old hands holding a broken compass. "That's what you did," she told Millie. "You gave him direction again." But not every moment was golden. One afternoon, while Arthur was reinforcing the fence, he slipped. His ankle twisted beneath him, and he fell hard. Millie heard the thud and rushed out, panic clutching her chest. But before she could reach him, Finn had already padded out from the porch, nudged Arthur with his nose, then sat beside him like a sentinel. Arthur laughed through the pain. "Well, at least I'm not alone." Millie helped him to his feet, tears shining in her eyes. "We need to be careful. We can't leave him behind." They knew what she meant. Finn was getting bigger, nearly 60 pounds now, with stronger muscles, sharper claws, and more curiosity than ever. He hadn't harmed anything, but the clock was ticking. Wildlife authorities, if they caught wind of this, might not see Finn the way Stillbrook did. "We have to get this right," Arthur said that night as they sat on the porch with tea and a blanket across their laps. "He's more than a bear. He's us." Millie nodded. "I know." That evening, Finn crawled into the spot between their chairs and laid his heavy head on Millie's slipper. She smiled down at him, stroking the top of his head, and whispered, "You're home, little one. But we'll fight to make sure it stays your home." And for a moment, under the stars and beside the porch light's glow, it felt like the world was gentle again. A wounded cub, two broken hearts, and a town learning how to love the wild. The knock on the door came just past noon on a Wednesday, when the sun sat high and Finn was dozing in the shade beneath the porch. Arthur was finishing a bird feeder. Millie had just pulled a rhubarb pie from the oven. The smell of cinnamon filled the air. Arthur wiped his hands on a rag. "You expecting anyone?" Millie shook her head. "Not today." He opened the door slowly, and standing there was a tall woman in a crisp green uniform, sunglasses perched on her nose and a clipboard tucked beneath her arm. "Good afternoon," she said. "I'm Claire Ridley. Wildlife Conservation Agency." Arthur's heart dropped. Millie appeared behind him, wiping flour from her palms. Her voice was polite but wary. "Can we help you?" Claire offered a tired but not unkind smile. "I'm just here on a courtesy visit. We received a few anonymous calls. Something about an injured animal in residence. Not accusing anyone of anything, just checking in." Arthur's fingers twitched. "We're not running a zoo, if that's what you're thinking." Claire chuckled, jotting something on her clipboard. "Didn't think so. Mind if I have a look around?" Before either could answer, a rustle sounded from beneath the porch. Claire turned, lowering her glasses. Finn emerged, sleepy-eyed, blinking, yawning wide enough to flash his small, rounded teeth. He ambled up the steps and plopped down beside Millie, leaning into her leg like a child seeking reassurance. Claire went still. Arthur braced himself. Millie didn't move. For a long breath, no one spoke. Then Claire slowly crouched. Not reaching, not threatening. Just observing. Is that a bear cub? Millie placed a hand gently on Finn's head. Yes. Claire looked at the animal. Then at them. Then around the yard, eyes narrowing on the partially built enclosure, the wheelbarrow, the fence, the fresh earth. He's not supposed to be here, she said softly. I know, Millie said. Her voice trembled only slightly. But we didn't plan it. He found us. And we didn't have the heart to let him die. Claire's expression didn't harden. It softened. Tell me everything. So they did. On the porch, with iced tea and quiet honesty, they told her the whole story. The storm. The cub's injuries. The healing. The bond. The town's support. Their fear. Their hope. And their plan to build a sanctuary space where he could live safely, where no one would force him away or turn him into a spectacle. Claire listened without interrupting. She asked a few questions, his diet, his behavior, their routines. When they finished, the pie sat forgotten on the counter. The only sound was Finn softly snoring at Millie's feet. Finally, Claire stood. She glanced at the enclosure again. Then at them. You understand this is technically illegal, she said. Arthur nodded, his jaw tight. We're not asking for special treatment. Just time. Claire stared at them. Then down at Finn. After a pause, she said, I'll file a provisional report. Say I saw an injured animal under watch. No violations. No cause for removal. But that buys you time, not forever. Millie's breath caught. How much time? Finish the enclosure. File the paperwork. Apply for sanctuary status. And make sure he's safe. If another agent comes by, I can't guarantee they'll look the other way. Arthur extended a hand. That's all we ask. She shook it. He's lucky to have you. But you're lucky to have him too. And then, just like that, Claire Ridley walked back to her car, the crunch of gravel fading down the road. The Mayfields watched her go. Then Arthur turned to Millie. We've got work to do. She smiled and wiped at her eyes. Yes. We do. And behind them, Finn yawned, stretched, and curled back into his favorite corner, completely unaware that the fate of his future had just hung on the kindness of a stranger and the strength of the truth. The following morning, the Mayfields were up before dawn. A quiet determination hung in the air like morning mist. Arthur tightened his boots, Millie packed a thermos of coffee and some biscuits, and Finn, still groggy from sleep, lumbered after them as they stepped into the crisp air of spring. The clearing behind the cottage had already begun to change. Logs had been hauled. Posts staked. Fencing coiled in thick bundles along the fence line. Now, there was purpose in every nail Arthur drove, every measurement Millie double-checked. Their small backyard was becoming something more, something sacred. It wasn't just about Finn anymore. It was about making space for the forgotten, the broken, the in-between. The animals that didn't fit cleanly back into the wild, and didn't belong behind cages either. You think it's foolish? Millie asked that afternoon, her hands in her lap as she watched Finn swat at a dandelion puff. Arthur looked up from the blueprints spread across their picnic table. What? Two old folks building a sanctuary like this. We're not exactly young. He smiled gently. That's why it matters. She looked at him, puzzled. Because if not us, then who? We've lived full lives. We've known loss and healing. We've learned how to stay when it's hard. What better hands could these creatures fall into? Millie didn't say anything, but her eyes glistened. That week, the town got involved again. Charlie Baxter brought lumber. Lucille knitted blankets for the rehabilitation room. Pastor Harlan organized a weekend work crew from the local church, and even teenagers who once teased each other about the bear people showed up with gloves and hammers. Everyone knew what was happening, and no one said a word to the authorities. Some stories, the town decided, were better protected than explained. The old garage was converted into an animal care unit. The barn was reinforced for winter shelters. A gentle walking path wove through the pines behind their property, leading to an observation deck for school visits. And at the center of it all, Finn. He watched the workers, sometimes curiously, sometimes lazily from under a tree, as if supervising their efforts. He had grown stronger and larger, but his spirit remained the same, gentle, curious, brave. When the enclosure was finally finished, Arthur and Millie stood together, fingers entwined, gazing at the gate that read in hand-painted letters, "Finn's Refuge." "That's what we'll call it," Millie said. Arthur nodded. "And someday, maybe, more than just Finn's." They opened the gate, and Finn wandered inside slowly. He sniffed the mossy logs, explored the shaded corners, splashed his paws in the little stream they'd diverted through the enclosure. It wasn't the wild, but it wasn't captivity either. It was freedom with care. That night, as the sun dipped low behind the pines, Arthur lit the lantern on their porch. Finn didn't sleep under the porch anymore. He had his space now, his den, his trees, his sky. But as dusk settled, he returned to the gate, sat down quietly, and watched the cabin where light glowed warm behind the curtains. Just watching. Just being near. Arthur saw him from the window and smiled. "He's still with us," he said. Millie placed a hand on his shoulder. "He always will be." And in the heart of a tiny town, beneath the stars and the hush of spring wind, a sanctuary was born, not just for wildlife, but for weary souls, for healing hearts, for the kind of love that doesn't need words. It had been 3 months since Finn's Refuge opened. Spring had deepened into early summer, and the forest behind the Mayfield's cottage now buzzed with life, dragonflies skimming the creek, robins nesting under the eaves, and the occasional deer slipping quietly past the sanctuary's outer fence. Finn had grown noticeably larger, his shoulders broader, his coat thick with health. He spent much of his time exploring the enclosure or napping beneath the birch trees Arthur had planted years ago, long before he ever imagined they'd be home to a bear cub. Then, one quiet afternoon, a letter arrived. It was addressed in faded ink and slightly wobbly handwriting. From Amy Brennan. To Arthur and Millie Mayfield. Subject, "That little bear." Millie read it aloud in the kitchen, her voice catching once or twice. "Dear Arthur and Millie, I hope you remember me. I'm the wildlife officer who picked Finn up after that storm, the one who left him in your care with more hope than certainty. I've thought about him often. Some stories stay with you, the ones that don't go the way the rulebook says they should. Back then, I wasn't allowed to check back in. Policy, they said. But policies are no substitute for peace of mind. Last week, I came across an article in our local newsletter. It had a photo, Arthur standing next to a sign that said Finn's Refuge, and a bear just behind the fence watching him like an old friend. I recognized the cub at once. He's beautiful. And more than that, he's safe, he's loved, and he's still wild in all the ways that matter. I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for keeping him alive, but for believing in a kind of love that doesn't always make headlines. If you'll allow me, I'd love to visit sometime. Not in any official capacity, just a friend dropping by to say thank you. Warmly. Amy Brennan. Millie set the letter down, blinking quickly. She remembers him, she whispered. Arthur was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. She should come. That weekend, they invited Amy to the refuge. She arrived in a dusty Subaru with tired eyes and a heart that, despite everything, still burned for the creatures she'd sworn to protect. Finn was lounging in the corner of his habitat when she stepped out of the car. He stood slowly, curious, as if sensing something familiar. Amy approached the fence, hands at her sides, no sudden movements. "Hey there," she murmured. "You probably don't remember me. But I remember you." Finn ambled closer. He sniffed the air, tilted his head, and sat down, just watching her. Tears filled Amy's eyes. "Looks like he remembers something," Arthur said gently from behind. They spent the afternoon walking the grounds. Amy was astonished by how much the Mayfields had built, how much care and detail had gone into every corner. She saw the fox in its rehabilitation pen, a pair of orphaned raccoons, and even a young red-tailed hawk recovering from a broken wing. "This place," she began, voice cracking. "This is what I always dreamed could exist. But I never thought it could be real." "It wasn't just us," Millie replied. "It was Finn. He taught us how to make space." That evening, they sat on the porch with iced tea and soft music playing through the screen door. Fireflies danced in the field, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Finn lay just beyond the fence, close enough to be seen, his head resting on his massive paws. Amy looked out at him. "You know," she said, "when I left him here that day, I thought I might never see him again. Never know what became of him. But this is more than I ever dared to hope." Arthur smiled. "He changed everything for us." Amy nodded slowly. "Sometimes it takes just one creature to open the door." And in the gathering dusk, with warm light spilling from the old cottage and the soft breath of summer in the trees, 3 old souls and 1 growing bear shared something wordless, something vast. A bond forged not in fear or ownership, but in quiet, sacred trust. By midsummer, the refuge was thriving. Volunteers from nearby towns came on weekends to help with repairs and feedings. Children visited during school breaks, wide-eyed and full of questions. Local artists even painted a mural on the outer wall of the barn, depicting Finn as a cub with Millie and Arthur beside him, a tribute to the unlikely family that had changed the valley. But then, one morning, Finn was gone. Arthur was the first to notice. He always woke early, and that morning, just as the first light spilled over the ridge, he stepped out with his coffee to check on the animals. The hawk was asleep on her perch. The raccoons were curled in their den. The fox was stretching in the grass. But Finn's pen stood empty. No sign of struggle. No broken fences. The gate was still latched. Gone. Arthur called for him, first softly, then louder. Millie appeared at the door, holding her shawl tightly. "What's wrong?" "He's not here," Arthur said, voice thin. "I don't know where he's gone." A silence stretched between them. Then they began to search. They combed the woods for hours, calling his name, shaking the treat bucket, leaving favorite blankets at the usual trails. They checked every camera trap, every fence post, every logging road in the area. Nothing. "He could have climbed out," Millie whispered that evening. "Bears his size have done it." "But why now?" Arthur asked. "Why after all this time?" They both knew the answer before it was spoken. Because he was growing up. Because nature does not wait for permission. Because even love must sometimes let go. Millie sat on the porch swing that night, staring into the trees. The forest seemed quieter, as if it too were holding its breath. Then, just after midnight, they heard it. A low, throaty huff from the edge of the woods. Arthur stepped into the yard with a flashlight, heart racing. He found nothing, no movement, no sound. But the next morning, there it was. At the foot of the porch stairs. A pine cone. Gnawed, slightly muddy. Finn's favorite kind of a gift. Millie gasped when she saw it. "He's still here." "He's watching," Arthur said, blinking hard. "He just wants to see who he is without us." And so they waited. Every morning, they'd check for signs. Sometimes it was a paw print in the mud. Sometimes it was a stick, carefully placed. Once, they found one of Arthur's old gardening gloves, chewed gently and dropped beside the gate. He was gone, but never far. As the weeks passed, the ache of his absence dulled into a quiet reverence. They had not lost him. He was simply walking the next part of his journey. They had given him a world, and now he was exploring it. Then one evening in August, after a sudden summer storm had soaked the valley, Arthur returned from his walk with something in his hand. He placed it gently on the kitchen table. It was a stone. Polished smooth by water, shaped like a heart. Millie looked at it, then at him. "No," she whispered. Arthur only nodded. Finn had left it at the bend in the trail they used to walk together. Placed it carefully. Deliberately. Millie picked it up, holding it close to her chest. "He's telling us he's okay," she said. "That he still remembers." That night, the porch light stayed on. Just in case. The first hints of autumn arrived earlier than expected. The leaves along the ridge began to blush gold and rust. A chill rode the breeze, curling through the valley in the early hours. Millie had just started unpacking the thicker quilts when the rain began, slow at first, then heavy and relentless, drumming against the roof like a memory that refused to fade. Arthur stood by the kitchen window, staring out at the drenched landscape. "He won't come out in this," Millie said softly, drying her hands on a towel. Arthur didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the tree line. But something deep inside him stirred. Around midnight, the storm broke open with a crack of thunder so loud it rattled the window panes. Millie woke with a start, and Arthur was already sitting up in bed. They both heard it at once. A low thump. Then another. Heavy, deliberate. Footsteps. Arthur grabbed his raincoat and opened the front door, the wind whipping hard against it. Millie joined him, clutching her shawl, heart racing. And there, in the pouring rain, stood Finn. Soaked to the bone. Bigger now. Wilder. But unmistakably him. He didn't move toward them. Just stood there, head bowed slightly, as if uncertain. Arthur took one step off the porch. Then another. "It's all right, boy," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're home." Finn let out a low, rumbly sound, half greeting, half apology, and finally stepped forward. They didn't hug him this time. He was too wild now. Too strong. Too much a creature of the forest. But Millie knelt just a few feet away, reached out her hand, and said, "You remembered the way." Finn's wet nose touched her palm, just for a second. Then he turned, lumbered to the old pine by the barn, and lay down with a huff. Just like he had as a cub. Arthur fetched a blanket. Milly poured warm broth into a bowl and set it on the porch. They didn't try to bring him inside. They knew he wouldn't stay. He didn't need walls. He just needed to know the door was still open. That night, the rain softened. And as the wind rustled the leaves, Milly and Arthur sat by the window, watching the sleeping shape beneath the pine tree, their hearts full with a quiet joy that words couldn't hold. He was still theirs. Not in ownership, but in love. By morning, the rain had passed, leaving behind a shimmering world of dew and the rich, earthy scent of wet pine and moss. Milly stepped out onto the porch, a steaming mug of tea in hand, her eyes scanning the edge of the barn where Finn had curled up the night before. He was gone. But in his place, under the old pine, lay a gift. A bundle of wild flowers, damp, flattened, clumsily gathered but clearly placed with care. Purple asters, goldenrod, and a few scraggly stems of something that might have once been Queen Anne's lace. Arthur joined her in silence, one hand resting on her shoulder. "He left us a bouquet," Milly whispered, a tremor in her voice. Arthur smiled softly. He always did have a way of saying things without needing to say them. For the next few weeks, Finn came and went with the shifting wind. Some mornings, they'd wake to paw prints in the soft earth near the porch. Once, Milly found a curious pinecone arrangement on the windowsill, an almost totemic display that reminded her of the stories her grandfather used to tell about woodland spirits. Sometimes, Arthur would catch a glimpse of him through the trees, just a shadow, a shape, a feeling that someone who loved them was watching from afar. They never tried to track him. He was free now. And that freedom was part of the gift. But the space he had once filled, the daily care, the shared meals, the healing, it hadn't vanished. In fact, it had grown. The barn, once cluttered with forgotten tools, had been transformed into a small but cozy rehabilitation shed. A neighbor brought over an injured fawn, a local boy dropped off a box of orphaned squirrels. Word was spreading, quietly, tenderly, that something special lived at the edge of that town. Something that knew how to mend broken things. Milly found herself smiling more. Arthur's steps grew lighter. The ache of old wounds, physical, emotional, eased a little with every new arrival, every creature that passed through their hands and back into the wild. And though they never caged or kept, the animals always seemed to linger a while, just as Finn had. Long enough to be known. To be loved. At night, when the stars burned bright over the valley and the owls called to one another in low, haunting tones, Arthur and Milly would sit together on the porch. No longer waiting. Simply sharing the quiet. The fence around their land was never mended completely. There were always gaps, spaces where the wild could pass through. That was how they wanted it. Because love, they had learned, wasn't about holding on. It was about never closing the gate. At first, it was just whispers. People in the town of Elder Hollow had always known Arthur and Milly Mayhew as kind, if a little reclusive. Most figured they were just aging quietly in their creaky cottage by the woods, living off the land, watching the seasons pass. But now, strange things were being murmured over cups of coffee at the diner and between shelves at the general store. "Did you hear Milly stitched up a fox's leg in her kitchen? Swear I saw a bear cub sittin' right by their porch swing last fall. I don't know what they're doing up there, but it ain't normal. It's good." One Saturday, the librarian's son, 10-year-old Mason, wandered too far while chasing his dog. He tripped on a root and cracked his arm clean against a rock. The dog ran off barking, and Mason sat there, soaked in fear and tears, until a shape appeared in the trees, massive, silent, and golden brown. A bear. But it didn't charge. Didn't roar. It stood still for a moment, then turned and lumbered off slowly down a path Mason hadn't seen before. Something in him told him to follow. The path led straight to the Mayhews' front door. Arthur carried him inside. Millie called the doctor. While they waited, she gave Mason warm tea and soft bread with honey. The boy, still shaking, looked around the kitchen at the shelves full of jars, the hand-knit blankets, the collection of feathers in a jar by the window. And on the wall near the fireplace, a painted wooden sign. "We help who needs help." After that, everything changed. Families began visiting, quietly at first. A girl brought an owl with a torn wing. A boy brought his injured ferret. Someone left a wounded goose in a crate by the gate with a note, "Please. If anyone can." And always, when Arthur and Millie stepped outside in the early morning mist, they'd find signs that Finn had returned in the night. A hollowed log newly rolled to the barn. Claw marks on the bark of his favorite tree. Once, a large trout left neatly beside their rain barrel. As if to say, "Still watching. Still with you." The town's respect turned to reverence. Not the loud, clapping kind, but the kind you carry in your chest, deep, warm, and quiet. Soon, a few of the townspeople offered to help. Sarah from the feed store donated supplies. Jonah, the high school shop teacher, built new wooden pens for recovering animals. Millie began holding little wildlife tea talks under the big oak tree for the children, explaining how to treat baby birds or why foxes yawn when they're nervous. Arthur taught the older kids how to track without scaring wildlife and how to sit so still the forest might forget you were there. And through it all, Finn remained a ghost, appearing only when he wished, vanishing before the world remembered he was real. But for the Mayhews and those they quietly healed, his presence was constant. A reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary love begins with a lost creature on your doorstep. It had been almost a full year since Finn had first stepped into the lives of Arthur and Millie Mayhew. Since then, Elder Hollow had quietly transformed. The Mayhew homestead had become more than a refuge, it was now a symbol. A living reminder that healing wasn't just for animals, but for the people who learned to care for them. But nothing prepared them for the morning the fence line trembled. Millie was in the barn with a young raccoon recovering from a broken hip when she heard it, a low, guttural huff, familiar, but deeper, older. She froze, heart pounding, and turned toward the wide-open barn door. Arthur was already outside, standing still in the meadow. His cane forgotten at his side. There, just beyond the wildflower edge of the clearing, stood Finn. But he was no longer a cub. He was massive now, his golden fur thick and glossy, his body strong, muscled, wild. But his eyes were the same. Gentle. Intelligent. Watching. Millie stepped outside, not daring to breathe. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Finn took one slow step forward. Arthur raised a hand, not in warning, but in greeting. "Look at you," he said softly, voice catching in his throat. "A mountain of a bear." Finn gave a low chuff, a sound that stirred something deep in both of them, a memory, a beginning, 1,000 unspoken things. He moved closer. Not threatening, not uncertain. Like he had never truly left. Millie met him halfway, tears slipping down her weathered cheeks. "You came back, darling. Just like you always knew you would." Finn leaned forward, gently pressing his massive head against her shoulder. She wrapped her arms around him without hesitation. Arthur stood beside them and rested a hand on Finn's back. For a few moments, the years melted away. There was no distance between past and present, between human and bear, between wild and home. After a while, Finn turned and walked with slow grace toward the barn, as if inspecting his old domain. He paused by the porch steps, sniffed the corner where he used to curl up, and then, incredibly, lay down. Just like he used to. Millie covered her mouth with one hand, overwhelmed. Arthur's voice cracked with quiet laughter. I guess he figured out where he belongs. That day, the sanctuary was still. The usual comings and goings of injured squirrels, owls, and curious children gave way to a profound calm. No one visited. No one interrupted. It was a day for family. For remembering. And for the silent, miraculous return of something once lost. As dusk approached and stars flickered in the growing darkness, Finn remained by the porch, resting. He didn't seem interested in returning to the forest just yet. Arthur sat nearby in his old rocking chair, his eyes never leaving the great bear. You came home, he said simply. Finn didn't answer with sound. He didn't need to. The fact that he stayed said everything. 2 nights after Finn's return, the skies over Elder Hollow darkened. Clouds rolled in like bruises, and the wind picked up a strange scent, earth and tension, like the forest was holding its breath. Millie was the first to notice the shift. She'd lived through 73 winters and could feel when nature's balance tilted. Something's coming, she told Arthur, peering out the window at the trembling birch trees. Arthur nodded, already moving to bring in the smaller animals from their outside enclosures. He didn't need to ask questions. He trusted Millie's instincts as he did the pull of the moon. By sundown, the storm had arrived. It howled through the valley like a wounded beast, snapping branches, ripping shingles, flattening wildflowers. The lights flickered, and then, with a final wheeze, the power went out. But in the darkness, the Mayhews' home glowed with firelight. Millie lit candles, one by one, until the house looked like it had stepped backward into the 1800s. Arthur sat by the hearth, gently stroking the ears of a trembling possum curled in a towel across his lap. And then, as the wind shrieked through the trees, came a low growl. Not of anger. Not of fear. Of warning. Arthur stood. He moved to the porch and opened the door. There, just beyond the reach of the storm's fury, stood Finn, soaked, gleaming in the lightning, and watchful. His huge form was turned not toward the cottage, but toward the woods behind it. Millie, Arthur called, bring the lantern. Together, they followed Finn's gaze. And then they saw it, thin, flickering threads of light through the trees. Fire. Lightning had struck somewhere in the eastern pines, and a blaze was already spreading. The rain hadn't reached that far side of the forest yet, and the dry underbrush, thick from the heat of early summer, was catching fast. Arthur's old heart stuttered in his chest. The sanctuary fence line. It's right in its path, Millie said. Without a word, they went to work. Millie radioed Jonah and Sarah from town, who had become unofficial guardians of the sanctuary in their own right. Arthur, despite Millie's protests, strapped on his boots and sloshed into the rain, checking the firebreaks he and the high school boys had dug last fall. Finn stayed by the cottage, watching as animals were gathered into crates and hutches. He circled the porch like a silent sentinel, every movement purposeful. When the first glow of the fire appeared along the ridge, Arthur looked up and saw something he would never forget. Finn, silhouetted against the smoke and lightning, standing between the fire and the Mayhews' home. His massive form unmoving. as if daring the flames to try. Help arrived just in time. Jonah, soaked and wild-eyed, came in a beat-up truck packed with sandbags. Sarah and 3 teenagers from town helped reinforce the fire line. The rain finally returned, sheets of it, cold and blessed, and by midnight the danger had passed. When it was over, Arthur slumped against the porch post, exhausted, watching as Finn stepped calmly out of the shadows, Ash dusting his back, his eyes steady. "You stayed," Arthur said, voice thick. Finn only blinked. Then he moved forward, brushing against Arthur's side like a cat far too large for such tenderness. Millie stepped out, wrapped in her rain cloak, and placed one hand on Finn's soaked fur. "We built this place for you," she said softly, "but tonight, you protected it." They didn't sleep much that night. Instead, the whole town seemed to move in quiet rhythm, checking damage, calming the animals, brewing pots of tea on gas burners and lantern stoves. And in the center of it all was a bear who had once been lost, and now stood guard over everything that mattered. The fire brought something unexpected besides ash and smoke. It brought attention. 2 days after the storm, as the forest still steamed with damp heat and charred branches, a green Subaru pulled into the Mayhews' dirt driveway. Out stepped a man in a corduroy jacket, holding a leather-bound notebook and a camera around his neck. Arthur was in the garden, tending to the singed wildflowers, when the man approached. "Mr. Mayhew?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. "That depends," Arthur replied, standing up and brushing dirt from his palms. "Are you selling something, or just lost?" "Neither," the man smiled. "I'm Calvin Brandt, reporter with the North Carolina Sentinel. Heard about the fire. Heard about the bear." Arthur frowned. "You mean Finn?" Calvin nodded. "I've been following the sanctuary quietly for a few months. When that video went up, of the fire line and the bear standing in it, I figured it was time someone told the full story." Arthur hesitated. He didn't like publicity. Didn't like being the focus of anything. But then Millie appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on an apron and smiling as if she'd known Calvin was coming. "You must be the reporter Jonah mentioned," she said kindly. "Come on in. We just put on a fresh pot of coffee." Inside, Calvin asked questions. A lot of them. About Finn's arrival, about the sanctuary's beginnings, about Arthur's heart condition and Millie's years as a vet tech. About how a bear had become part of their family. Arthur was wary. Millie, a little less so. But what surprised them both was Calvin's listening. He didn't interrupt. Didn't twist their words. He just let them speak. At one point, he turned to Finn, who lay on the porch as usual, paws crossed like a lounging dog, and asked, "Do you think he knows he changed your lives?" Arthur looked at the bear for a long moment before replying. "I think," he said slowly, "he knows we saved each other. That's enough." 2 weeks later, the article came out. "The Bear Who Stayed, How Love, Loss, and a Golden Cub Changed Elder Hollow Forever." It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatized. It was honest. And it touched people. Letters began arriving in the mail. Drawings from children. Donations from strangers. One woman sent a hand-knit scarf for the bear if he'll wear it. A retired zookeeper offered to volunteer at the sanctuary. A widower in Virginia wrote simply, "I didn't think I could feel again. But now I do. Thank you." The sanctuary, which had always been held together by grit and grace, now had something more: support. People cared. People believed. And still, Finn remained the same. He didn't seem interested in the fuss. He still wandered off into the woods for days at a time. Still brought back pine cones and sticks as gifts. Still rested on the porch each night like the world depended on him being there. Maybe, in some way, it did. That fall, when the leaves turned to fire and gold, Arthur and Millie stood at the edge of the sanctuary trail as a group of third graders from Durham arrived on a field trip. The teacher, a bright-eyed woman with a loud laugh, introduced each child like they were VIP guests. And when Finn appeared at a distance, watching from the tree-line, every child gasped. But Arthur raised a hand. "No shouting," he said gently. "We don't own this place. We just take care of it." The children quieted. Finn watched a while longer, then disappeared into the trees like a dream returning to sleep. That night, Arthur and Millie sat on the porch in their usual chairs, a blanket between them, hot tea in hand. The wind was crisp. The stars above were brighter than ever. "You think we did right by him?" Millie asked softly. Arthur looked out over the valley, the place they'd fought to protect, the lives they'd rebuilt, the sanctuary that had become more than land. He nodded. "I think," he said, "he did right by us." The first snow of the year came gently, almost shyly, flakes drifting like feathers from a pale gray sky. It coated the branches of the trees, dusted the wooden fence posts of the sanctuary, and turned the worn porch of the Mayhews' cottage into a stage of silence and white. Finn noticed the change before anyone else. He'd started spending longer hours close to the cabin, bedding down under the old oak tree that bent slightly toward the kitchen window, where Millie often stood peeling apples or stirring soup. He ate heartily, instinct guiding him to build up his fat stores, but he didn't retreat to a den. Not yet. Millie watched him through the glass one evening, arms folded and a dish towel over her shoulder. "He's staying," she said quietly. Arthur, sitting at the kitchen table polishing the wooden feeding trough, looked up. "You sure?" She nodded. "Every year, he's gone by now. But look at him." Finn was curled near the porch, head on his massive paws, snow slowly piling up on his thick golden-brown coat. His eyes weren't closed. He was watching. Listening. "He's waiting," Millie whispered. Arthur stood, walked to the window, and joined her. They said nothing for a while. Then Arthur turned and pressed a kiss to her temple. "He doesn't hibernate because he knows we still need him." That night, the wind howled low and strange, like a far-off train, and the lights flickered. The old generator kicked on with a sputter. Millie threw another log onto the fire while Arthur checked the small animals in the indoor pens. Finn didn't move. He lay still, breathing in the snow. And when, sometime near midnight, a coyote approached the edge of the property, slinking through the trees toward the coops, Finn stood. He didn't charge. Didn't roar. He simply rose to his full, towering height and made a low sound, a deep, ancient hum that stopped the coyote cold. The intruder turned and vanished without a sound. Finn returned to his place, settled again, and resumed his quiet watch. By morning, the yard was full of tracks, small paws, cloven hooves, feathered prints in powder. But all around the cabin was a perfect circle of untouched snow, marked only by Finn's body and the long trail where he had paced back and forth in the darkest hours. When the sun rose, golden and soft, Arthur stepped outside with a thermos of hot broth and a thick wool blanket. He didn't say anything. He just sat on the porch, beside the bear, and poured a little of the broth into a bowl, setting it gently down. Finn didn't touch it. Not yet. He simply leaned his great shoulder slightly against Arthur's knee, as if to say, "I know you're here. I'm here too." Inside, Milly watched through the glass, her eyes misted with tears. In all her years, she'd seen animals rescued, healed, and released. She'd loved and lost, hoped and rebuilt. But never had she witnessed something so simple, so sacred, as the silent bond between a tired man and the wild creature who refused to leave him. Elder Hollow had always been a quiet town, nestled like a forgotten bookmark between two ridges of pine-covered hills. But as winter deepened, something remarkable began to stir among its people, something warm, quiet, and full of light. It started with a child. 8-year-old Clara Wendell, whose third-grade class had visited the sanctuary that fall, asked her mother if they could leave a lantern at the sanctuary gate so the bear doesn't get lonely in the dark. Her mother smiled but didn't dismiss it. 2 nights later, a small glass lantern hung from the post outside the Mayhews' sanctuary, flickering golden against the snow. By the weekend, there were 20. Families from town brought candles in jars, lanterns on shepherd hooks, strings of warm fairy lights wound around pine branches. Someone built a wooden bench. Someone else dropped off a basket of handmade seed cakes and wrote, "For the birds, and anyone else hungry," in red ink. Arthur and Milly were stunned. They hadn't asked for this. They hadn't even known people noticed. But now, every evening at dusk, people came quietly, lanterns in hand, children bundled in coats and carrying drawings of Finn or letters that simply said thank you. No one asked to see the bear. No one banged on the gate or shouted. They just lit the path. Finn watched from the trees. Sometimes he came closer, circling the edge of the clearing where the lights glowed like stars that had fallen to earth. Sometimes he sat near the fence, his breath rising in puffs as children whispered to him through the wire. And once, when Arthur limped out with a thermos of cider to share with the townsfolk, he saw Finn watching from the hill, still, golden, present. A silent guardian of the place he now understood wasn't just his home. It was a haven for all creatures who needed light in the dark. That Christmas Eve, Arthur had an idea. He bundled himself in his thickest coat, wrapped a scarf around his neck, one that a local girl had knit, for the bear, but it might be too small, and walked the trail to the old stone outcrop that overlooked the valley. It was bitter cold, and his breath wheezed slightly as he climbed, but he made it. There, he set down a small lantern of his own. Not a fancy one. Just a simple mason jar with a flickering candle inside. He looked out over the valley, his valley, Milly's valley, Finn's, and whispered, "You found us when we didn't know we were lost." He turned to leave, but then he heard it. A low sound, steady and warm. Turning, he saw Finn behind him, silent as snow, his eyes soft in the candlelight. They stood together for a while, the old man and the bear, side by side beneath a sky thick with stars. And from the forest below, the warm glow of the lanterns shimmered like a heartbeat that refused to dim. Winter passed slowly, as it always did in Elder Hollow, with days that blurred into soft grays and long nights filled with the crackle of firewood and the quiet hum of sleep. But eventually, like a sigh of relief, the snow began to melt. The streams woke first, rushing and playful again, followed by the birds, then the shy flowers that poked through thawing ground like secrets too long buried. Finn stirred from his winter rhythm, lean but healthy, his thick coat now mottled with new growth. He stretched his long limbs beneath the waking trees, shook out months of stillness, and padded down the slope toward the cabin, just as he always did. Milly was waiting. She stood on the porch with a mug of tea in hand, wrapped in Arthur's old wool coat, which she'd claimed after he left it one night during his watch with Finn and forgot to bring it in. It still smelled faintly of cedar and cinnamon. Finn stopped just short of the porch, as he always had, but his head tilted, watching her, studying her face like he always did when something was different. And something was. A folded piece of paper rested on the porch railing, held down by a smooth river stone. It was in Arthur's handwriting. Milly hadn't known about it until the day before, when she cleaned out his writing desk and found it tucked into a journal, labeled only, "For spring, if I'm not there." She took a shaky breath, stepped forward, and unfolded it. Finn didn't move. "Dear Finn," she read aloud, her voice trembling, but she didn't stop. "I know you'll come back when the frost lifts. You always do. That's the kind of soul you are, faithful without promises, present without demands. That's why I left this for you. Because if I'm not there when you return, I want you to know something." Milly paused, swallowed, and kept reading. "You were never just an animal to me. You were a mirror of the parts of myself I thought I'd buried with my youth. The tenderness I thought I'd lost. The courage I didn't know I had left. You reminded me how to feel, Finn. Not just exist." Finn's ears flicked gently, eyes focused, unmoving. "I don't know what the next spring will bring. I hope I'm there to greet it with you. But if I'm not, don't mourn me. Just keep doing what you do best, living. Loving. Guarding what's good in this world." Milly's voice broke, but she read the final words anyway. "I'll be watching, from wherever the light goes when it leaves the sky. Arthur." Finn lowered his head slightly. Then, to Milly's astonishment, he stepped forward. Slowly. Gently. He placed one massive paw on the porch step. Just one. As if that was all he needed to say, "I heard him. I remember." Then he turned and walked back into the woods, not with sadness, but with steady, quiet dignity. Milly wiped her eyes and pressed the letter to her heart. In that moment, the porch, the cabin, the valley, all of it, felt wrapped in something far greater than grief. Something closer to grace. It was a Tuesday morning in late May when the knock came. Light rain tapped against the window panes of the cabin, and Milly was finishing a batch of elderberry muffins for the volunteers arriving later that afternoon. The fire crackled. The birds were just beginning their chorus. The knock came again, soft but urgent. Milly wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened the door. It wasn't a visitor from town. It was a man, young, soaked to the bone, holding a bundle wrapped in a flannel shirt. The bundle moved. I didn't know where else to go," he stammered. "I found him near the highway. He was crying. There was blood. But no mother. No siblings. Just him." Milly reached for the bundle. Inside was a bear cub, no older than a few weeks. Mud-streaked, his eyes barely open, and a gash across his flank. He whimpered faintly, his tiny body shivering. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't held something this small since the early days with Finn. "Come in," she said gently, ushering the man inside. "We'll take it from here." By nightfall, the little cub, whom she quietly began calling Button, after the mismatched ear shape that reminded her of a crooked button on Arthur's old fishing vest, was warm, cleaned, stitched, and resting in a crate beside the fireplace. Milly sat near him, tea forgotten in her hands, watching the rise and fall of his breath. The storm outside deepened. And somewhere in the woods beyond, a low grunt echoed. Finn. He always came when something changed. As if the forest whispered to him what the humans couldn't hear. She stepped onto the porch and saw him standing at the tree line, barely visible through the curtain of rain. She didn't speak. Just nodded once. He stood there a long time, unmoving, eyes on the cabin. On her. On the crate. She could almost hear Arthur's voice, let him see. Let him decide. The next morning, the sun returned, and so did Finn. Millie carried Button onto the porch, wrapped snug in a blanket. Finn approached slowly, cautiously, as he always did when something fragile was near. He sniffed the air. Then the bundle. Then Millie's hand. Button stirred, whimpered, and reached a paw out blindly. And Finn, giant, scarred, majestic Finn, lowered his great head and gave a soft, rumbling huff. Not a warning. Not a challenge. A greeting. A beginning. Millie blinked back tears. She had seen it once before, the moment when two lives, so different, recognized each other. The forest had given her a second cub. And it had given Finn something too, not a replacement, but a new bond. A reason to stay. Button recovered quickly, faster than anyone expected. The gash along his flank healed cleanly, and within days, his tiny legs were scrambling over cushions, paws clumsily batting at furniture, legs, noses, and anything that dared move. He was a burst of wild energy wrapped in fluff, and the cabin hadn't felt this alive in a long, long time. Millie tried not to laugh too loudly when he tripped over the hearth rug, but she couldn't help it. Even the volunteers, many of whom had come to know the quieter rhythms of the sanctuary, found themselves drawn to the cub's chaotic charm. But it was Finn who surprised them all. The older bear watched from a distance at first, always calm, always steady. When Button was carried outside to the porch in the mornings for supervised sunshine, Finn appeared like clockwork, never approaching too closely, never aggressive. Just present. One morning, Button, still a little unsteady on his legs, waddled off the porch and tumbled softly into the grass. Millie gasped and hurried forward, but stopped. Finn was already there. The old bear stepped gently between the cub and the woods beyond, his body a silent wall of protection. He lowered his head, sniffed the cub, and let out a deep, steady huff. Button looked up at him, wide-eyed, ears perked, and without hesitation, climbed right onto Finn's massive paw. Gasps rippled from the porch. Finn didn't move. He let the cub cling to his fur, nuzzle against his arm. He didn't lift him, didn't play, just sat with him. Guarded him. Trusted him. That's how it started. From that day forward, Button would yelp at the door in the mornings until he was allowed outside. And Finn would be waiting, sometimes lounging beneath the maple tree, sometimes pacing near the garden fence. Always near. Always watching. Their bond was quiet, like most things in nature. No dramatics, no grand gestures. Just closeness. Presence. The way the old bear would lie down in the shade so Button could climb over him. The way the cub mimicked Finn's movements, practicing mock growls or paw swipes at the air. The way Finn would pause and glance toward the porch whenever Button wandered too far. "He's teaching him," one of the volunteers whispered to Millie. "He's really teaching him." Millie nodded, her throat tight with something she didn't have a word for. Not long after, Finn began leading Button on short walks into the trees. At first, just a few steps from the cabin, always within view. Then deeper. Longer. Each time, Button came back a little more confident, a little less afraid. And each time, Finn returned with him. One evening, after a longer-than-usual outing, Button stumbled back through the brush with a proud look in his eyes and a stick twice his size clutched awkwardly in his teeth. He dropped it right on the porch. A gift. Finn stood just beyond the tree line, his eyes locked with Millie's. She understood. This was more than play. It was a passing of something sacred, something that couldn't be taught by humans alone. Something only a bear could give to another bear, a sense of place, of instinct, of belonging. And in that moment, under the gold of a fading sun, Millie realized. Arthur had been right. The healing they'd given Finn was now coming full circle. Through him, they were saving another. Summer deepened, and the sanctuary thrived. Button grew faster than anyone expected, his legs thickening with muscle, his eyes brighter, his coat glossier with each passing week. He was still playful, mischievous even, but there was a new edge to his energy now. A confidence that only the wild could give. Finn still watched over him, but he had begun to pull back, just slightly. Instead of walking side by side, he would trail a few paces behind. Instead of lounging under the maple tree, he would rest farther off, closer to the forest's edge. It wasn't neglect. It was instinct. He was teaching Button something Millie and the others could not. How to be alone. How to be wild. Millie noticed it. And it made her heart ache in that bittersweet way, like watching a child take their first step away from you. That afternoon, while Button napped in the sun-drenched patch behind the cabin, Millie pulled out Arthur's old cigar box. Inside, she kept things that mattered, a photograph of them from their 30th anniversary, the key to the old truck they never used anymore, and a bundle of letters bound with twine. Most of them were letters she and Arthur had written to each other back when he was away in the early years, before the sanctuary, before Finn, before this quiet life had settled around them like a warm shawl. But one letter stood out. Its envelope was unsealed, its pages soft from being read too many times. Arthur's final letter. She hadn't read it since Finn had arrived. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. The ink was faded now, but Arthur's words rang as clearly as the day he'd written them. If one day, the quiet returns to our home, let it be filled again. Not with noise, not with people, but with presence. With something worth listening to. Something wild. Something that needs you. Millie closed her eyes. Button stirred in his sleep and let out a tiny whimper. Finn, almost imperceptibly, rose from the shadows and stepped closer. Later that evening, after dinner and after the last volunteer had left for the day, Millie walked out to the clearing where Arthur was buried beneath the cedar tree. She carried the letter with her. She sat beside the stone, her knees creaking, and laid the letter down. "We did it, Artie," she whispered. "We filled the quiet." The wind picked up. Soft. Gentle. Familiar. Behind her, a twig snapped. She turned, half expecting to see Finn. But it wasn't Finn. It was Button. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his head slightly tilted, as if sensing the reverence in the air. Slowly, he padded toward her and sat beside the stone. He didn't sniff, didn't paw. Just sat. As if he knew. Millie reached out, her wrinkled hand brushing against his thickening fur. "You're part of this now," she said. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden rays through the trees. And in the hush that followed, Millie could almost hear Arthur's voice again. "Let it be filled again." She smiled. It already was. By the time autumn crept in with its crimson leaves and rustling winds, Button had nearly doubled in size. His playfulness remained, but there was a new seriousness in the way he watched the birds take flight, or how he'd stand motionless by the stream, studying the flow of water as if trying to understand it. Finn had all but stepped into the background now, always present, always near, but allowing space. Letting Button become his own bear. It wasn't just the bears who had changed. The sanctuary was changing, too. Word of the Mayfield refuge had spread across the region. School groups came for visits. Injured animals arrived with gentle knocks at their door, brought by strangers who'd heard what this place had become. A safe place. A last chance. A home. And Millie, though her bones ached more, and the days felt longer, still woke every morning with purpose. Button had become more than just a rescue. He was legacy. He was the embodiment of everything she and Arthur had quietly worked toward all those years. The quiet proof that kindness wasn't weakness. That healing was possible, even for things with claws and teeth. One day, as she sat on the porch with her journal open, Millie found herself sketching. She wasn't much of an artist, but the shapes came anyway, Button perched on a tree stump, Finn in the background, the valley laid out like a memory behind them. She smiled, touching the page with her fingertips. Then she looked up and gasped. Button was standing on the ridge. The same ridge where Finn had once stood, watching over the valley. Only now, Finn wasn't there. The old bear hadn't come back the night before. Millie had noticed, but said nothing, hoping he'd wandered farther than usual. But now, seeing Button up there alone, she knew. Finn had gone. No sound, no fanfare. Just a final glance, a quiet exit. Like Arthur. Like all things that understood when their time had come. Button let out a low, rumbling sound, something between a hum and a huff. Then he turned and looked down toward the cabin, eyes locking with Millie's across the field of swaying grass. He didn't need her to call. He came down on his own. She met him halfway. She didn't speak, didn't try to comfort. She just pressed her forehead gently against his thick shoulder, and they stood together, a grieving woman and a growing bear, in a silence that said everything. Later that night, she lit a candle on the porch. For Arthur, she whispered. For Finn. The flame flickered in the wind, dancing. Button sat at the edge of the porch, watching it. Then he turned, lumbered to the spot where Finn used to sleep, and curled into a tight, quiet ball. It was his place now. His story. His sanctuary. And Millie knew, deep in the quiet chambers of her heart, that even though loss was inevitable, what they had built here would remain. Because sometimes, the things we leave behind are not things at all. They're lives. Changed forever. The leaves turned gold, then brown, and fell in soft swirls that Button chased through the fields like ghosts of laughter. But soon, the air grew sharp. The hills of Maple Hollow bristled under frost, and birds flew low across the valley, moving south, away from the coming cold. It would be Button's first winter alone. Millie knew it. He did, too. She watched him with quiet eyes as he began to slow his days, eating more, resting longer, digging small hollows in the earth and then abandoning them, testing places for the den he would finally choose. He didn't sleep on the porch anymore. He didn't curl against the cabin at night. He was pulling away, but not out of distance. Out of instinct. Out of the same wild rhythm that Finn had once shown him. Millie prepared the way a mother might prepare for a child leaving home. She packed bundles of food into dry, hollow logs near the far ridge. She scattered hay inside the caves Button had sniffed. And she left little things, too, things he might not understand, but might feel. Like a strip of Arthur's old flannel shirt. Or one of her gloves, worn thin at the fingers. One morning, after the first hard frost, Millie stepped out to the porch and found Button waiting. He sat quietly, his breath misting in the cold air, eyes darker than usual. "I know," she said softly, her voice catching in her throat. "You're ready." He didn't move. So she went to him. She placed one hand on his face, just as she'd done when he was a tiny cub the size of a boot. "You've got this," she whispered. "Winter doesn't stand a chance." He leaned into her hand. Just for a moment. Then he turned and walked away. No fanfare. No backward glance. Just the heavy, sure-footed stride of a bear who knew where he was going. Millie watched until the trees swallowed him whole. That evening, the cabin felt larger, quieter. She lit the lantern Arthur had always used for night feedings and set it in the window. "For the wanderers," she said to no one. "For the wild ones." Snow came hard that week. Thick, heavy drifts that blanketed the valley in silence. Roads closed. Volunteers called to cancel. The sanctuary grew still. But the animals remained. A fox with a limp still needed feeding. A goose with a clipped wing still hissed from its warm crate. And so Millie worked. One evening, after tending to the fox, she paused at the far ridge, her boots crunching in the snow. There, across the white expanse, she saw them, faint prints, large, familiar. They led up toward the cave near Widow's Peak. Her heart ached. Not from sadness, but from pride. He'd made it. He'd found his place. And that night, wrapped in a blanket beside the fire, Millie didn't feel alone. Somewhere out there, in the cold silence of the mountain, Button was sleeping soundly. Curled tight. Dreaming the ancient dreams of wild things. And she? She was dreaming, too. Of spring. Of return. Of the quiet that still held love in every corner. Spring came quietly to Maple Hollow. No great fanfare, no dramatic thaw, just a slow exhale, like the valley itself was waking from a long-held breath. Patches of earth reappeared beneath the melting snow. The stream behind the cabin sang again, louder each day. Crocuses pushed up through the frozen ground like tiny hands reaching for the light. Millie moved slowly that season. Her joints ached more than they had the year before, and even simple chores left her short of breath. But something deeper than pain lived in her now, something warm and rooted. Hope. She found herself glancing toward Widow's Peak each morning, eyes drawn to the tree line where Button had disappeared months before. She knew better than to expect him back right away. Bears returned when they were ready, not when you missed them. Still, she hoped. The sanctuary stayed busy, more busy than ever, in fact. With Sophia's help and a growing network of volunteers, Millie had turned the old barn into a proper medical center. The fox's leg had healed, and it had been released into the hills beyond the Mayfield's land. The goose, now permanently grounded, had been given a small pond and a name, Clementine. But the heart of the sanctuary still lived in the trees. One golden afternoon in early April, Millie was outside sweeping the porch when she felt it, that quiet, certain stillness, like the moment before a song begins. She turned. And there he was. Button. Thinner. Taller. Wilder. But unmistakably him. He stood at the edge of the clearing, one paw lifted mid-step, as though unsure if he should come closer. Millie dropped the broom and slowly made her way forward. "Well, look at you," she said softly, her voice cracking with something too old to name. He didn't run. He didn't charge. He just watched her with those deep eyes, then padded forward until they stood just feet apart. Millie reached out, slow, respectful. He lowered his head and pressed it gently against her chest. No one moved for a long time. No wind stirred the trees. No birds sang. It was just them. The bear who had grown into the forest. And the woman who had given him the space to become himself. When he finally pulled back, Button made his way toward the cabin and, just like old times, settled into the grass beside the porch, eyes half closed in the sun. Millie sat beside him, a hand resting near but not on him, the way they used to when he was learning to trust. "You made it," she whispered. "You came back." She didn't need an answer. Because sometimes, love doesn't speak. It returns. And takes its place right where it belongs. Years passed, as gently as the wind moving through the trees. Maple Hollow changed in small ways. The town added a new bench to the square, painted the library door blue, and started a spring festival called Bear Day, a quiet tribute to the story that had touched every heart. Children wore fuzzy ears. Cupcakes were sold with little honey pots on top. No one ever said Button's name outright, but everyone knew. Millie and Eli grew older, as all living things do. The cabin became quieter. The stairs creaked more. The rocking chairs wore the shape of their owners. But the sanctuary bloomed. What had begun as a frightened cub and a grieving widow had grown into something far larger, something that pulsed with purpose. Dozens of animals came and went through the sanctuary, a raccoon with burned paws, an orphaned fawn, even a bald eagle with a wounded wing. Some stayed. Some healed and returned to the wild. All of them carried a piece of the hollow with them. Button remained a constant presence, not always close, but never truly gone. He would vanish into the forest for weeks at a time, yet always returned, especially on Eli's birthday and every spring morning when the first green shoots appeared beneath the trees. He brought gifts sometimes, feathers, river stones, once even a rusted old tin badge someone must have lost decades ago. He had become something more than a bear. He was memory. He was myth. He was family. One evening, as golden light spilled across the porch, Eli sat beside Millie in silence. She had grown quieter over the years. Her hair, now snow-white, framed a face mapped with laughter and loss. "Do you ever wonder," Eli said, "if he knew what he did for us?" Millie didn't answer at first. She just watched the forest. Then, she whispered, he didn't need to know. He just needed to be. A figure appeared at the edge of the trees. Button. Older, his fur streaked with gray, his gait slower, but still him. He came close enough to sit on the patch of grass he'd claimed years ago. And there the three of them remained, two humans and a bear, warmed by fading sunlight, wrapped in the silence of a bond that never asked for words. When Millie passed peacefully in her sleep that winter, the town wept. Not just for her, but for the chapter she closed. Eli held a quiet ceremony in the clearing beyond the porch. A chair was left empty. And in the days that followed, Button lingered by the cabin longer than usual, silent and still. Eventually, Button, too, returned to the deeper woods. But never fully disappeared. Because every time a frightened animal arrived at the sanctuary, every time a lonely child met a gentle fox, or an old man smiled at the memory of a bear who once stole his soup, the story began again. The sanctuary was renamed Millie's Hollow. And on the sign, carved carefully beneath the name, were 5 simple words. Love, like wild things, endures.